Well, with the success of the wheat belly lifestyle, thousands of people doing this thing where you eliminate this creation of modern agribusiness called
Yeah.
wheat, and we also address a handful of nutrients that are just not well supplied by a modern lifestyle. And as we age, we lose the ability to activate vitamin D in the skin like we did when we were younger. So we supplement vitamin D. And there's a few others. But nutrients not lacking in the diet, but lacking in modern life. And all those nutrients, by the way, synergize to reduce insulin resistance, which is a very, very important thing to do in modern life because much of the world now is insulin resistant, the process that leads down the path to type 2 diabetes, obesity, hypertension, coronary disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, cancer, etc. So having control over insulin resistance is a very big advantage. Well, people all did this. And they come back and they say things like, hey, I lost 57 pounds doing this, never cut my calories, was never hungry.
Dr. William Davis, welcome to the Keto Camp podcast.
Thank you, Ben. Glad to be here.
I was just telling you offline, I'm a big fan of your work from your previous books, Wheat Belly, Undoctored, and now you have this amazing book, which I'll hold up for the YouTube audience, called Super Gut. And we're going to dive deep into your brand new book, which is out now. Before we do, Doc, I'd love to get into your story. Why did you become obsessed with the gut? And I know your background as a cardiologist, so what's your backstory?
Well, with the success of the wheat belly lifestyle, thousands of people doing this thing where you eliminate this creation of modern agribusiness called
Yeah.
wheat, and we also address a handful of nutrients that are just not well supplied by a modern lifestyle. As you know, like magnesium. By necessity, Ben, we have to drink filtered water. You can't go to the lake, stream, or river because if you did, you'd get sewage and herbicide, pesticide runoff. So we have to supplement magnesium. Most of us you live in a tropical climate. I live in a very northern climate where even if it's a July day, you often don't get sufficient sun exposure to activate D in the skin. Of course, much of the year, the sun's much too weak.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we wear clothes over much of the surface area. And as we age, we lose the ability to activate vitamin D in the skin like we did when we were younger. So we supplement vitamin D. And there's a few others. But nutrients not lacking in the diet, but lacking in modern life. And all those nutrients, by the way, synergize to reduce insulin resistance, which is a very, very important thing to do in modern life because much of the world now is insulin resistant, the process that leads down the path to type 2 diabetes, obesity, hypertension, coronary disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, cancer, etc. So having control over insulin resistance is a very big advantage. Well, people all did this. And they come back and they say things like, hey, I lost 57 pounds doing this, never cut my calories, was never hungry. My hypertension is gone. I'm off 3 blood pressure medications. My fatty liver is reversed. I'm no longer a type 2 diabetic. I'm off insulin and some of the other injectable drugs. Uh, but people also said this, I lost 57 pounds, but I need to lose another 35. And I'm plateaued, I'm stuck. Or somebody who was a type 2 diabetic and had a horrendous hemoglobin A1C, a long-term measure of blood sugar, way in the stratospheric range, like 12.7, which is a disaster. They do the basic program, comes down maybe to 5.9. Much better, but not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect would be 5.0% or less. Or somebody has an autoimmune disease. A common example is rheumatoid arthritis. They'd say, my pain, swelling is so much better. I'm off that biologic. You're saving me $2,000 a month in copay. And I'm off the prednisone that was making me fat and diabetic. But I stay on the naproxen because I do have a little bit of a flare-up now and then. So the question I asked was, why? What are we not doing? Now, the basic program, Ben, did include a high-potency multi-species commercial probiotic, fermented foods, and prebiotic fiber. So there was an attempt, but it became clear that was not enough. And so when we started poking around the microbiome, it became clear, Ben, that there's a ton more you could do. And in most instances, when you did that, people finally said, yep, my weight loss plateau is broken. My hemoglobin A1C is now 4.7%. My rheumatoid arthritis is now gone. So I think we got our finger on the thing that was lacking, additional efforts to address this massively disrupted thing in modern people, the microbiome.
Yeah, and I love the way you described that. So people were getting good results, but they wanted to go from good to great. And by addressing the microbiome, which you do in your book and with your work, that's where you take them from getting good results to great results to everlasting results. In your book, you mentioned the difference between the DNA we get from our parents and our grandparents and our ancestors that are passed on versus our current microbiome, how that's vastly different than the microbiome of my grandparents and my great grandparents. Could you get a little bit into that?
Yeah, with each successive generation, Ben, the microbiome gets worse and worse and worse. At its extreme, if we compare our microbiomes to the bunch of indigenous populations around the world that have had their microbiomes examined, like the Yanomami in the Brazilian rainforest, the Matsas in the highlands of Peru, the Maasai in Kenya, the Hadza in Tanzania, the Malawi in Eastern Africa, the Maori in New Zealand, several others. They have very different microbiomes. These are the populations of humans who've never taken an antibiotic, who don't get exposed to glyphosate and Roundup. They don't have other herbicides, pesticides in their food, air, and water. They don't take stomach acid blocking drugs. They don't take anti-inflammatory drugs. They don't get synthetic additives in their foods. And their microbiomes very different. They have great many more microbes than we have. They have different species that we don't have. And oddly, when you compare the microbiomes of all those different cultures who don't contact with each other, some are on different continents and, of course, don't have airplanes and jets or boats. But their microbiomes are oddly similar to each other, very closely similar. So it's presumed by microbiologists and anthropologists that represents the microbiome how it used to be, so-called Stone Age microbiome. But each successive generation, from your great-grandparents to your grandparents to your parents to you, and then you to your children, there's a degradation in the quality of the microbiome. Fewer species, less diversity among species, and proliferation of unhealthy microbes. And it's because of all those things I just listed, the exposure to antibiotics, drugs, additives. Antibiotics are probably at the top of the list for things that really disrupt the microbiome. So your listeners should know that most people by age 40 in the US have taken 30 courses of antibiotics.
It's crazy.
There are 800 prescriptions for antibiotics written every year for every 1,000 people. Now, there's a time and place where you need them. If you had pneumococcal pneumonia and you can't breathe, your fever of 104, you need an antibiotic. But they're also dispensed, as estimated by the CDC, 30 to 50% of all antibiotics dispensed are inappropriate and unnecessary and of no benefit to the recipient. For instance, you have an upper respiratory viral infection. You got a cough, dry cough, and your primary care doctor says, here, take this prescription for Zithromax just in case it becomes bacterial. Not recognizing that one course of antibiotics you probably cannot fully recover from. That is, you kill off species in your microbiome that can't return. Just like if you have a pile of rags in your garage, it doesn't turn into rats, right? You can't create species, you can't recreate species. And so we've been throwing essentially bombs into our microbiomes and just thinking that the only consequence was diarrhea. And of course, that is simply not true.
Yeah, that you make a fair point. They're prescribing antibiotics for urinary tract infections. It's so commonly prescribed. And even if you're not actually prescribed it and taking it, in the book, you make the case for animals that are pumped full of antibiotics. We're eating these caged animals, and it's almost impossible to escape it. So we have two options. Either we could go live with those tribes and be isolated from the world and restore our microbiome, or we could identify the hidden and stressors going on: antibiotics, herbicides, pesticides, glyphosate, wheat, processed foods, inflammatory fats that you spoke about in the book, and we could start removing that. One thing I wanted to ask you is, you said it's almost impossible to restore the gut back to where it was before the antibiotics. Now, let's say somebody followed your program, they did all the right protocols, and they've been doing this for quite some time. I mean, what amount of time would it take if somebody does everything right to get it back as closely as possible, the gut, to where it was before a round of antibiotics, for example?
It's not clear that we can do that, but you can try. I think the microbiome almost becomes a career of its own. That is, it's not something you take. People say, just give me the pill, right? Well, no, it doesn't work that way. It's a matter of it's a combination of things. So I would say typically it depends on the measure you're following. If your measure is getting rid of irritable bowel syndrome, probably take a few months.
Okay.
If your interest is triggering weight loss, probably a few weeks to months. So it all depends on what it is you're trying to achieve. But this raises a question. Should you and I and your listeners mimic the microbiome, say, of those primitive cultures? Well, probably not. Their microbiome is to some degree an adaptation to their unique environments. And we, of course, don't live that way. Maybe we don't need all those microbes, but there are some questions that are unsettled. For instance, they have a whole bunch of these species like Treponema species. And we have none of them except for the one that causes syphilis. They have a lot of Prevotella, and we don't. But there are some microbes that are clear that we really should restore. And these typically are the microbes that are very sensitive to standard or common antibiotics. My favorite is Lactobacillus reuteri, Reuteri, named after the German microbiologist who discovered this microbe in 1962, Dr. Gerhard Reuter. Well, back then in the 60s, he found it commonly in everyday people. He had no problems identifying reuteri in people's stool or other sources. As his career went on, he only died recently. As his career went on, he had a harder and harder time finding people who carried it. And then several studies have suggested that almost all of us have lost it. Well, reuteri is exceptionally sensitive to antibiotics, common ones like ampicillin. So if you took ampicillin, which is very common for upper respiratory viral infection, you killed off your reuteri, and so most people don't have it anymore. But it's one of those microbes that when you restore, all kinds of fantastic things happen. Because one of the things this microbe does is it oddly takes up residence in the upper GI tract, not just the colon. And it sends a signal to the brain via the vagus nerve, a retrograde signal up the vagus nerve to the brain. And it tells your hypothalamus and pituitary to release the hormone oxytocin. And I bet most of your listeners know what oxytocin is. It's the hormone of love and affection and empathy. And so people do this. They restore reuteri, and they tell me, thousands of them, oh yeah, I like my spouse better. I like my family better. They don't annoy me as much. I like my coworkers better. I understand other people's points of view better. But there's also effects that go beyond the social and emotional effects. The ladies go berserk because they hear that oxytocin also increases the deposition of collagen in their dermal layer of skin, so they start to lose wrinkles. They have moister skin. There's an acceleration of healing. There's deeper sleep. I'm a chronic insomniac, Ben. Before reuteri, I relied on high doses of melatonin, like horse doses of melatonin to sleep.
How much were you taking?
15 milligrams, sometimes 20.
Yeah.
And of course, you're left hungover the next day. Well, with the reuteri, I don't take anything, but I sleep 9 hours straight through vivid dreams. And those of us with actigraphic devices like Apple Watches and Whoop and Fitbit will see a lengthening of the REM period of sleep also, the restorative phase of sleep that helps you maintain mental health. So deeper sleep, longer sleep, your appetite is cut back. Food still tastes great, but you're just not that interested in food as much. There's a restoration of youthful muscle and strength, which can be very dramatic. There's an improvement in the immune response. There's an increase in libido. So when you think about this, Ben, so restoring this one lost microbe, Lactobacillus reuteri, brings with it smoother skin, restoration of youthful muscle and strength, preservation of bone density. Failed to mention that one. Very important for the ladies. Increased libido. I don't think it's a stretch to say that what happens with restoration of this one microbe, there's many others, is reversing aging by at least a decade or two. And we see it play out in a lot of people's photographs they share with us, where someone who's, say, 65 now looks 45. It's a variable experience, to be sure, but for many people, it is a very impressive experience from restoring one microbe.
That's amazing. So you're telling me that it's not as easy as just taking probiotics and eating fiber. There's a lot more we have to do. Is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that was what frustrated me. When I read books, I have the advantage of more recent science too. But where you read books, and if all they have to say is take a probiotic and get some fiber, well, there's a ton more you could do. It's like take care of your car, make sure you change the transmission fluid. Well, there's a lot more you could do to
Yeah.
take care of your car, and
Now
there
let me
really is a ton of things you can do.
Now, in regards to probiotics, and I love that you speak about in the book, and you have different recommendations in the appendix. I love that you had Sugar Shift in there, who I had Martha Carlin, who helped with the development of that product, and she's actually in my Keto Camp Academy. So I love Martha. She actually emailed me a few weeks ago. She's like, "Hey, I think you should reach out to Dr. William Davies. He has a new book out. I think you have a good conversation." I'm like, "We're actually booked for a conversation." So she was already ahead of the game there. But in regards to probiotics. Now I know that it's a $1 billion industry, probably a multi-billion dollar industry, and that's why there are so many people pushing it. A lot of people in the health space, fitness space, take your probiotic, eat the fiber. Is there a problem with taking the wrong types of probiotics, like pharmaceutical grade or just cheap probiotics for a long period of time? Can it potentially create monoculturing inside of the digestive system, inside of the gut microbiome?
You're right, Ben. There's a lot of problems with the current crop of commercial probiotics. Among them, they often don't specify strain. Now, this is kind of makes people's eyes glaze over, but you need to know the strain. For instance, I have E. coli, you have E. coli, your listeners have E. coli. But if you eat E. coli on contaminated lettuce from cow manure, you can die of that E. coli. Same species, different strain. Another example is Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG strain has been shown to be quite effective in shortening the period of diarrhea after an antibiotic, but not other strains of Lactobacillus rhamnosus. So most commercial probiotics that contain that species don't tell you which strain. And they typically don't put in the GG because the GG is more expensive. And so you buy a costly probiotic, and maybe you think it's going to help you get over diarrhea, but it doesn't contain the right strain. So failing to specify strain, major problem. More and more companies are starting to specify strain. Another problem with that is, though, they start to apply proprietary strain designations. So that if they took GG, they might call it ABC123, and you can't tell what it is. And you call them, and they say, "We can't tell you. It's proprietary." Very frustrating.
Yeah.
Another problem is, so Martha Carlin and the microbiologist she works with, Dr. Raul Cano, they're champions of an effect called collaborative guilds or consortia. That is, microbes, just like humans, we don't live in isolation. We collaborate. We work with each other. We go to school with each other. We play with, right? Microbes are the same way. And that a product you mentioned, Sugar Shift, is a collaborative. It's the only product I know of, Ben, that actually has a collaborative guild or consortium of bacteria that Raul has proven collaborate with each other and generate synergistic effects.
Super cool.
We use the Sugar Shift, and I have no relationship with Martha Carlin or Raul Cano except my friends. We gave it to about 20 of our participants in our programs, and these are non-diabetic people. Saw a drop in blood sugar, fasting blood sugar of almost 10 milligrams per deciliter.
Wow.
That's huge. That's on a par with prescription drugs. But of course, something like Sugar Shift or a probiotic doesn't cause side effects. You don't have edema, liver damage, all the stuff that happens with drugs. In fact, you get side benefits from these things. So that's another problem, though, with most other probiotics. There's no collaborative effects. Then there's all kinds of other problems. There's some companies doing double encapsulation because they've been fooled into believing that a probiotic should survive untouched until it gets to the colon, where they think it's supposed to exert most of the effects. Well, that's a big miscalculation, because many modern people, by my estimation, a third of all Americans, and I think it's worse than that, 1 in 3 people, has a proliferation of unhealthy stool microbes in the small bowel, in the 24 feet of small bowel. So you want your probiotic to release into the small bowel. You do not want to double encapsulate it, have it released into the colon. And there's some other problems. You make a point, though. Will you get a monoculture, like a field of corn or wheat? Probably not, because the probiotics are not that powerful. Now, well, I should mention another problem with commercial probiotics is the lack of including what are called keystone species. These are species so important to other species. So, my best analogy is plankton in the ocean. Plankton feeds whales, jellyfish, and other filter feeding species. Well, if there's a reduction in plankton, and by the way, there is a reduction in plankton because of global climate change and the acidification of the oceans. If plankton goes down, so do whales and jellyfish. So plankton are a keystone or foundational species. The same principle applies to your microbiome. If you lose foundational species, keystone species, you start to lose other species. So restoring those keystone species is very, very important. Unfortunately, some of these probiotics don't pay attention to what are keystone species. Rhodori is a keystone species. Lactobacillus gastritis is probably keystone. Akkermansia, there's a bunch of these things. And people don't have to memorize these things. And so I fear that most commercial probiotics are just haphazard, slapdash collections of microbes with no rhyme or reason to the combination. It'll evolve, Ben, so maybe give it another couple, 3, 5 years, and we will have much better choice. But right now, the choices are very limited.
Yeah, interesting. So when you, in your book, I love that you talked about gallstones and the mistakes so many people make by following a low fat, high carbohydrate, low calorie approach. And here's where I want to bring the conversation to relate it to my specific audience, which is more of a low carb keto audience. And I see this a lot. As a matter of fact, the number one struggle I see with people who transition to a higher fat, low carb diet is these digestive issues like either constipation or diarrhea, a lack of quality bile flow from the liver, and even gallstones. So could you talk about the issue with why people actually get gallstones, and what is a smart approach as you're transitioning from a high carb, low fat to flipping that around? What is a good way to get into that?
Yeah, you're right. It's a very common problem, very alarming for people. But people have fallen into the misinformation of fat causes gallstones. Fat does not cause gallstones. General surgeons, those are the guys who take your gallbladder out, are guilty of saying to people, I took your gallbladder out, now make sure you cut your fat. They think that because fat brings out the symptoms of gallstones, that it's a cause. It's not a cause. Now, not all the causes have been identified, but there are several causes we do know about, because now there have been 3 studies, not my studies, other people's studies, where they did something really interesting. They took mostly women. Women are much more prone to gallstones than guys, and put on either a low-fat diet or a low-calorie diet, or both, low-fat, low-calorie diet. And then they ultrasounded, very simple test, look at the gallbladder, at day 0, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. A shocking number of these ladies developed gallstones within 30 days, and then many more by the end of 90 days. In some of the studies, as many as 55 to 62% of the ladies developed gallstones at the end of 3 months. An astounding number.
Wow.
This was very revelatory because it showed how quickly they can form and how awful it is to cut your fat, cut your calories, or worst of all, cut fat and calories. Simple logic. If you cut your calories and or fat, your gallbladder is not prompted to squeeze out its bile because it stores bile. And so you get bile stasis, you get crystallization, you get stone formation. Now, the situation's even worse. If you look at gallstones in modern methods using DNA methods, it looks like gallstones are filled with stool microbes like E. coli and Klebsiella. Now, wait a minute here.
Crazy.
The gallbladder empties into the duodenum, which is 24 feet above the colon where stool microbes. How did stool microbes get into the gallbladder and the duodenum? Well, it's SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, where stool microbes and other microbes have ascended and now occupy all 30 feet of so people who present with gallstones typically also have SIBO. That's simply not addressed. The gallbladder is taken out, and then the surgeon says, make sure you cut your fat, which makes the situation worse. And so my experience has been, if you take out the gallbladder, people typically don't have problems with digesting fat. Now, but let me clarify. So let's say you have a gallbladder and you're a woman who in her 50s, you've struggled with weight, you've had periods of cutting fat and or calories, and you develop silent gallstones. Now you say, oh, I'm going to go low carb or keto or whatever. And now you're eating a lot of fat. Well, you're prompting all of a sudden your gallbladder to work like crazy, and some of those stones are expelled into the bile duct, and that's when you get all the gallbladder pain. And people say, oh, must be the fat causing the gallstones. No, the gallstones were there all along. The increased squeezing of your gallbladder simply unmasked their presence.
So what would be the solution there? Meaning what could help with that? Would taking bile salts help? Would increasing your bitter rich food? Would just supporting the liver help out? Like what would you recommend somebody do if they are starting keto and they're worried that that might happen to them?
Well, it depends on the symptoms, because, if you're really having gallbladder symptoms and one of those stones lodges in your bile duct, it is potentially catastrophic. I mean, really bad, really sick, sepsis, peritonitis, and I mean, meaning like drains and all kinds of bad things. So gallstones are not something to fuss with. There's some track record for use of bile salts. They're not all that effective. If you can find a gastroenterologist to give them to you, they do sometimes work. But I fear that the key is to not develop gallstones. Never cut your fat. Never cut your calories. Eat as dictated by your body. And of course, if we have eliminated wheat, the gliadin protein of wheat, that is a potent appetite stimulant, that helps also, because you're not tempted. You don't have to deprive yourself. The other thing about wheat and grains is you remove wheat germ agglutinin, which is completely undigestible by humans. And wheat germ agglutinin is a potent blocker of a hormone called cholecystokinin, or CCK. So if I eat some food and it hits my duodenum, the duodenum releases CCK, and it tells the gallbladder, release your bile. It tells the pancreas, release your pancreatic enzymes. If you have wheat and related grains in the vicinity, it blocks CCK, and it causes bile stasis and pancreatic failure of the pancreas to release its enzymes. And so it's getting rid of wheat and grains, a big step forward. Addressing your SIBO, a big step forward. But I can't tell you it's easy to reverse gallstones. That I can't tell you.
Yeah, that's interesting about the CCK. You mentioned that in the book, cholecystokinin. It probably makes sense why when I used to eat a whole bunch of wheat, I was hungry all the time, because CCK helps satiate you and helps you feel full. I do want to ask you this question and just go back to your other book, Wheat Belly, for a second, and then we'll go back to Super Gut. In the book Wheat Belly, you talk about, and this, I always share this and I always give you credit for it, but you talk about 2 slices of whole wheat bread and the postprandial glycemic response from 2 slices of whole wheat bread, how that's equivalent to either a 12-ounce can of soda or a Snickers bar. Do you still stand by that? Is that really what you've seen?
Yeah. If you look at any table of glycemic index in a dietary textbook or any study, you'll see that whole wheat bread has among the highest glycemic indexes of any food. And so it's there in plain sight. It's been known for years. But for some odd reason, most of my colleagues and dietitians have chosen to ignore this simple fact. And of course, even worse, people say, okay, well, I'll be gluten-free. And they eat gluten-free breakfast cereals, breads, pasta, bagels.
Sugar bombs.
Yep. Made with cornstarch, rice flour, tapioca starch, or potato flour, that, very few things raise blood sugar higher than whole wheat. Well, among the few, rice flour, tapioca starch,
yes,
gluten-free flours. And so that's why people say, oh, I went gluten-free, but I gained 30 pounds and I became a type 2 diabetic. Those foods are horrible. But a little understanding can go a long way.
It does. It's really brilliant marketing. Credit to these brilliant marketing companies, but it does us a lot of harm. Okay, so let's talk back to Super Gut. In the book, you talk about 2 essential vitamins and minerals that we want to make sure we have adequate amounts of. And number 1, vitamin D, which is actually a steroid hormone, and magnesium. So what's the role of vitamin D and magnesium with our Super Gut?
Unknowingly, Ben, so the 4 common nutrients that are lacking in modern life that I included in the original Wheat Belly program 11 years ago, and then the Undoctored program, and now I did not appreciate back then that they did all kinds of great things for your health. but they also had a role in microbiome. I did not appreciate that. So vitamin D has been now shown, clearly shown, to amplify the intestinal immune response. Omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, DHA, activate the enzyme intestinal alkaline phosphatase that partially disables the toxins released by some bacteria. The magnesium is an osmotic agent that it pulls water into your bowels, and it prevents slowed passage of digested food. If you get really slowed passage from digested food because you got exposed to the gliadin protein of wheat, which is an opioid, or you take other opioids, or have some other reason for slowed transit of your GI tract, you cultivate unhealthy microbes, especially what are called methanogens that produce methane. Taking magnesium accelerates the passage of food through the GI tract, and you're less likely to have slowed transit and methanogenic overgrowth, a different kind of SIBO. Mm-hmm. Taking iodine ensures that you're not going to get hypothyroidism from lack of iodine, because when you have hypothyroidism, transit once again is slowed, and you cultivate unhealthy microbes. And so I didn't appreciate back then that those four nutrients really each played a role, contributed to maintenance of a healthy microbiome. You have to go further, but they're essential components, basic components for rebuilding a healthy microbiome.
Yeah, I love that. And vitamin D specifically, not only does it help with your digestive system, I mean, there's so many other benefits to it. And what I've seen, even in Florida, looking at lab work from people who live in Florida or states with a whole bunch of sunshine, vitamin D deficiency almost all the time when I'm looking at lab reports, because unfortunately the range on the lab report is 30 to 90 to 30 to 70. So if you get a 32 or 38 or 42, the standard doctor, the conventional doctor is saying you're fine, but that's really a deficiency. We want to get that above 60. And then also I've seen as we lower insulin, it makes vitamin D even more effective, meaning they have this inverted relationship. So you could take a whole bunch of vitamin D, eat a whole bunch of vitamin D rich foods, but if you don't reduce your insulin, get the gluten out and do the things that you're talking about, it'll be almost impossible to get the optimal vitamin D levels. Have you seen that to be true as well?
That's a phenomenon I've not observed, Ben, but very interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I've seen that. And so all the things that you're recommending go hand in hand, because you get rid of the wheat, you get rid of these sugar bombs, these gluten-free fake foods, and you eat vitamin D rich foods, supplement with vitamin D. It has a great effect. You mentioned already SIBO during this conversation. And in the book is heavily, you write a lot about SIBO, which is small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. For somebody who has no idea what that is, they maybe heard what it is, could you explain what it is? And I know you recommend an amazing new test that's very simple and effective to test to see if you have SIBO.
Yeah, so as we lose all those important species, in their place, mostly bowel, stool organisms have proliferated, E. coli, Klebsiella, Citrobacter, and many others. And then they ascended up the small bowel. So it all adds up to 30 feet of microbes occupying your entire GI tract. Now, these microbes, trillions of them, don't live for decades. They live for hours, minutes to hours. And so there's rapid turnover, trillions of these microbes living and dying. When they die, they easily penetrate the small bowel wall, because the small bowel only has a fragile single layer mucus barrier. Colon has a 2-layer, much stronger mucus barrier. That's where microbes are supposed to stay. Yeah. But when they get up into the small bowel, they're easy, both bacteria themselves as well as their breakdown products. Now, those breakdown products are especially important because they enter the bloodstream. This is a process validated by a Belgian group, and since validated numerous times, in 2007. It's called Endotoxemia. But that process now makes clear, this is the thing people call gut leak or intestinal leak for many years. Well, now it's established fact. The evidence is quite solid. Bacteria break down, release their byproducts into the bloodstream, endotoxemia. But it tells us now how and why microbes in the 30 feet of GI tract can be experienced as a skin rash like rosacea or psoriasis, or as a central nervous system or brain process like depression. That's a big one. Or Parkinson's disease, or Alzheimer's dementia, or seizures, or a joint and muscle process like fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis. In other words, it really shines a new light on all those and many other diseases. So in other words, if you have, let's say, rheumatoid arthritis that was initiated by SIBO and endotoxemia, and you're taking some drug just to block an inflammatory pathway, but do nothing about the SIBO and endotoxemia, bad things are coming because you didn't address the cause. The doctor did not address the cause. And it can lead to weight gain, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, hypertension, coronary disease, dementia, other neurodegenerative, a long list of diseases. So what my colleague, you know this, Ben, my colleagues, the mainstream doctors, should be experts at nutrition and nutritional supplements, nutrients, and the microbiome, but they're not. It was not part of their training. But the worst part of it is the willful ignorance of things in health because they just don't pay enough. And so in other words, the gastroenterologist more interested in scheduling you for an endoscopy and colonoscopy rather than talking to you about your SIBO and dysbiosis. The cardiologist more interested in talking to you about the stress nuclear test that costs up to $14,000, or the heart catheterization that nets about $80,000 for the hospital, or the bypass surgery goes between $150,000 and $200,000. That versus talking to you about bowel health and getting prebiotic fibers and making yogurts. So you can see the problem. But this is why what you're doing, Ben, and other podcasters and YouTubers, what you're doing is so, so important because the doctors have abdicated their responsibilities. And to make it worse, you may have noticed that big media, broadcast and print, no longer like people like me or you on TV or because we potentially antagonize the interests of big pharma, their $6 billion a year advertiser. And so while I was on Dr. Oz 4 times, CBS This Morning numerous times, a lot of the other morning shows, all doors got slammed shut a few years back. I noticed it when Undoctored came out, and I thought it was just me, but it's not just me.
Wow.
It's all authors on health. But I even had somebody in publishing say this to me. You know, if we can't make money on books on health, maybe we won't print books on health.
Wow.
Yeah. It's like Hitler all over again. So
It's
big
crazy.
pharma has, in effect, strangled big media, and big media has gone along with it. And so that's why I say what you're doing, Ben, other podcasters, et cetera, is so important because not only are my colleagues not doing their job, big media is not doing their job either. And in fact, they're favoring big pharma.
Yeah, well, that speaks volumes, and times have changed, and it's been getting worse the last couple of years with what you just mentioned, the censorship and big pharma, big media. When I interviewed Dr. Kay Shanahan, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work. She was the nutritionist for the Lakers when Kobe Bryant was there. She wrote the book Deep Nutrition, Fat Burn Fix. But she said this. She said, because we were having a conversation on industrial seed oils and why dietitians and doctors still promote them. And I like that you called those oils out in your book. But she said the American Heart Association is the biggest fake news media in the entire United States, and how they're funding a lot of these studies that these dietitians are looking at, and which is why they're promoting like corn oil, canola oil, et cetera. Which is exactly to your point. But to close the loop on the SIBO conversation, you in the book, you talk about an easy way to test. It doesn't have to be something complicated. You talked about the AIR device.
Yeah, you know, Ben, this was the device, the AIR device, AIRE. The company is Food
There
Marble.
Say that again, Food Marble?
Food Marble.
Got it.
And by the way, this is the old device. The new one came out literally yesterday.
Oh, cool. Perfect.
The inventor, Dr. Angus Short in Dublin, Ireland. And they shipped out their first batch yesterday, literally. So, and the new device is different colors, black, and it measures both hydrogen gas and methane. This older one just measures hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas is the dominant gas produced by microbes. But I was guilty, Ben, of thinking that SIBO, 30 feet, trillions of bacteria, was an uncommon thing. And then when I got hold of this in 2018-19, and thousands of people tested their breath for hydrogen gas, I was shocked. It was the exceptional person who tested negative.
Wow.
So what this is really, it's kind of a sounding device. Doesn't use sound, it uses gas detection. But in effect, a sounding device to figure out how high up bacteria are. And lo and behold, it is rampant, out of control. very conservatively estimated. 100 million people have it. I think it's more. I think it's more like 180 or so million people. It's a lot. So at least 1 in 3 people have it. And yet my colleagues will continue to treat your hypertension with blood pressure medication, your arthritis with anti-inflammatory drugs, your high blood sugar with blood sugar lowering drugs, even though it's microbes in the GI tract at the root cause for many of these conditions. But it's very elegant. It's easy to use. Talks to your smartphone, and the new device gives you levels of hydrogen gas and methane. Dr. Angus George, now my friend, initially invented it to detect hydrogen gas because his girlfriend, now wife, had irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, and was told to go on a low FODMAPs diet. And he saw how difficult it was for her, and she'd get exposed and have gas and diarrhea, etc. So he invented this device to help her navigate. And so it was released initially in 2018 as a device for people with IBS to navigate a FODMAPs, low FODMAPs diet. Well, I got a hold of it and I called him up. I said, Angus, this is a lot more than that. This is a device to map out SIBO. It's also a device to navigate all food intolerances. People who say, oh, I can't eat nightshades, I can't eat histamine containing foods, I can't eat fruit, fructose, sorbitol, blah, blah, blah. No, those are all forms of SIBO. Great grandma had none of these problems. We have them, they're rampant. And you've seen these people. Yeah. I can eat a list of 4 foods only. Every other food I'm intolerant to. That's not, the problem is not the food. The problem is the massive disruption of the microbiome, including proliferation of unhealthy stool microbes in the 30 feet of your GI tract.
This is interesting. So how would you use that to identify a food intolerance, a food sensitivity? What would be you would eat the food and test like an hour later? Like, how would you use that?
So timing is critical, Ben. So because if you had small bowel, 24 feet of small bowel that did not have unhealthy microbes, you should eat something that microbes like to eat. Let's say beans, legumes, or hummus.
So lectins, something with lectins is I'm imagining.
Not lectins.
No, okay.
Because those are essentially indigestible. But let's say inulin in coffee.
Okay.
If my bacteria are in my colon, I drink the inulin, it should take a minimum of 90 minutes to get to the colon because it's 24 feet, right? A squiggly small bowel. If I drink that inulin in my coffee and I convert to, say, a high level of hydrogen in 30 minutes, I have bacteria way up high because it can't get to the colon that fast. Anytime you register a positive on this device, it's a 0 to 10 scale. If there's a rise of 4, let's say from 2 to 6 or 3 to 7 or 8, that's a positive reading. And it means you, within the first 90 minutes of consumption, it means you have bacteria high up in your GI tract. And of course, then you take some action to push those creatures back and cultivate healthy species. Then you can test again and see if you've normalized. In other words, if everybody tests abnormal and stays abnormal, there's something wrong with the test.
Yeah.
But people are correcting it, and they say, I was blowing 10s, which is very common. I now blow 1.2 tops, and my joint pain is gone. Or I finally broke my weight loss plateau. Or I finally got my hemoglobin A1C to perfect, below 5.0%. So all those residual problems we saw are broken through by doing it. Now, your listeners should know, you don't have to buy this device to succeed on this. You can do it without it. And by the way, the conventional answer for SIBO is to prescribe an antibiotic. Well, antibiotics got us here. I'm a little reluctant to say take more antibiotics to solve this problem. It doesn't solve the problem. It just reduces some of the unhealthy bacteria. And of course, the gastroenterologist doesn't tell you how you got it, how to prevent the common recurrences. So we've been doing something different. We went through a period of using herbal antibiotics, and there's some value to that also. But I tried something different, Ben. And that's preliminary, though. I had not conducted a formal clinical trial yet. But, if you take a commercial probiotic like we talked about for SIBO, will it get rid of your SIBO? No. It typically reduces the bloating, maybe diarrhea a little bit. That's about it. Well, what if we chose microbes that colonize the upper GI tract? That's where SIBO occurs. And what if we chose microbes that produce what are called bacteriocins? These are natural antibiotics effective against the species of SIBO. So I picked three. I picked Lactobacillus gasseri. There's a strain of gasseri that takes up residence upper GI tract and is a bacteriocin powerhouse, produces up to 7 bacteriocins.
Wow.
Our old friend rhodori, Lactobacillus rhodori, produces up to 4 bacteriocins, takes up residence, small bowel. And I added Bacillus coagulans, a strain of that, and we co-ferment them as yogurt. Now, not to be confused with the nonsense you buy in the grocery store. We're going to ferment it all together, 3 together, and let it ferment for an extended period. And that's because bacteria, there's no male and female bacteria, right? They have asexual reproduction. That is, one microbe doubles to become 2 and so on. So we put in these 3 microbes, let it ferment for 36 hours. We get several billion bacteria by doing that. Then we consume half a cup a day. And so far, Ben, 90% of people who've done that have converted to H2 negative.
Wow.
So that's anecdote.
Yeah.
But so far, I'm very encouraged. I think we have stumbled on a way to use fermented foods like yogurt to get rid of SIBO. And it's just yogurt, so benign.
Yeah, interesting. And in your book, you have like the recipes for that. You also have an entire appendix on the SIBO protocol. You have one for H. pylori. You also have a chapter about mucus, which maybe we could get into a little bit, because you're in that chapter. You're like, I know you hear the word mucus and you think, ew, this is gross, but it's very important to understand that mucus is beneficial. So maybe we could talk about mucus a little bit.
Sure. So it's something people say, ew.
Right.
Because they think of the stuff you cough up during the flu or something like that.
Right. Exactly.
But mucus is essential. It's in all your mucous membranes. It lines your airway, your nasal passages, your GI tract. It's a lubricant, but it's also a protective factor. So as I mentioned earlier, the colon is good at making mucus. It has a 2-layer, very strong mucus barrier, because we know the colon is loaded with stool microbes as well as stool, and you don't want those things entering the bloodstream or the lymph system. The small bowel is not quite as good. It only has a single layer of mucus barrier. It's much easier to breach by bacteria and their breakdown products. And we're exposed to many things in modern life that screw up the mucus barrier. Emulsifying agents are at the top of that list. These are additives added to food, like peanut butter and ice cream. Ice cream can have several. Salad dressings, other foods that have long lists of ingredients include such things as polysorbate 80, carboxymethylcellulose. We don't have a full list of all the things that do this, but those are the 2 worst ones so far.
Where does carrageenan stand with that?
Probably.
Okay.
It's not been formally studied, but it probably does have an emulsification property.
Okay.
So rule of thumb is don't eat processed foods.
Mm-hmm.
Just go back to avocados and olive oil and eggs and meats and vegetables, so you don't get exposed to the additives, because the emulsifying agents, I liken it, Ben, to, if you ever have a dish, a kitchen sink full of greasy dishes and water, and you put a drop of dishwashing liquid and you see the oil disperse immediately. Yeah. Well, that's what these emulsifying agents do to your mucus barrier.
Not good.
And of course, unhealthy microbes erode the mucus barrier, loss of keystone species. There are species that are very good at helping promote mucus production. There's one called Fecalibacterium. It's very good. You want lots of Fecalibacterium. But if you're not eating properly or you lost it, you're going to have an impaired mucus barrier, and that really impairs health, and it opens the door. It invites diseases like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, irritable bowel syndrome, as well as emotional effects, anxiety, panic attacks, depression.
Yeah, what happens in the gut happens in the brain, and vice versa. I do want to ask you this as we're wrapping up this amazing interview. I would like to understand, and maybe for the audience benefit too, because you mentioned once you take care of SIBO, you see people break through weight loss resistance, those last 20, 30 pounds. I'd like to understand more the relationship between how SIBO may create weight loss resistance and how taking care of SIBO helps somebody break through. What is the exact pathway or process there?
So people with insulin resistance, that is their brain, muscle, liver, don't respond to insulin. And so the pancreas compensates by increasing production of insulin. So if I took someone who's slender and active, and check their fasting insulin. It's about 1 or 2 or 3 microunits per liter. It's very low. It's near zero. Let's say I took somebody who's got a lot of visceral fat, a big waist, has high blood pressure. Their fasting insulin is not 1 or 2. It's 40, 90.
I've seen it. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's much higher. Well, when you have high levels of insulin, it causes fat deposition, fat accumulation, and it blocks weight loss. Well, one of the effects of endotoxemia, in fact, the original study from 2007 by Dr. Patrice Kenny in Belgium, that was what they looked at. How much does endotoxemia contribute to insulin resistance? Yep, it does. Endotoxemia is a major driver of insulin resistance and keep that insulin leveled up. So you reverse endotoxemia, you reduce endotoxemia, and insulin drops and you release weight. So it's a very nice process, as well as all the other health benefits of reducing endotoxemia.
Right. What was the study regarding that? I'd like to put it in the notes.
I don't recall the title, Ben, but it's Dr. Patrice Kenny, C-A-N-I, and it's a paper from 2007 looking at insulin resistance and endotoxemia.
We'll get that. Well, Rachel will find that and put it in the notes. Okay, that's interesting. That makes total sense to me. Now, somebody's probably wondering, all right, we're talking about different bacteria, Akkermansia. There's others like Firmicutes and other. What's the best way to test your gut microbiome? Is a stool test best? And if it is the best way, do you recommend a specific company to get that testing done?
Stool testing, like probiotics, is evolving, and they're not all that. There's some that are pretty good. One of the problems is, like probiotics, there's some problems. Yeah. One is most of the testing services only drill down to genus. So with a microbe, if let's say we had Escherichia coli, E. coli, Escherichia is the genus, coli is the species, and then you can have a strain designation like EON1 or something like that. Well, many of the services only tell you genus. Well, that's a problem. Let's take Clostridia. Clostridia can be Clostridia difficile that causes bloody diarrhea after an antibiotic, can kill you. There's Clostridium perfringens that causes gas gangrene in war wounds in soldiers. There's Clostridium botulinum that causes botulism. But then there's Clostridium butyricum, which is wonderful for health and provides all kinds of health benefits. So if you have a stool testing service and they say you have Clostridia, well, which one is it?
Yeah, good point.
So you want to get some of the services where they go down to species, maybe even strain. There's only a handful that do that. Another problem.
So I use, and you could tell me if you want to comment on them or not. We could cut it out if not. But I use the gut tumor from Vibrant Wellness Labs. Have you looked at them at all and see how they do it?
I'm impressed, Ben. That's probably the best.
Okay,
of the commercial platforms I'm familiar with. It's costly, as you know. It's like $700, but it's probably the best test out there if it fits in your budget. Thrive, Thryve, is a close second for $99, so it's pretty good. A lot of those others simply just don't tell you enough, though. Another problem with some of them is they don't tell you how much. So if they tell you, for instance, you have Akkermansia, but they don't tell you how much, well, it's useless. Or if they tell you have a pathogenic species, how much do you have? Do you have a lot that's causing health problems, or just a teensy-weensy, minuscule amount doesn't matter at all? So all they say is you have X, you have Blaudia, but doesn't tell you how much. Mm-hmm. It's useless. And there are services that don't do that yet. So the one you mentioned, GutZoomer, is the best as far as I know. And Thrive, Thryve, is a pretty close second.
Awesome. All right. Well, I want everybody who's listening and watching to go to the link in the notes below. And there's going to be a link to purchase this book right here called Super Gut. It's available on paperback, Kindle, on Audible. I saw it was available on Audible as well. The book is amazing. It even talks about artificial sweeteners, some of the approved natural sweeteners that we align with, like monk fruit and stevia, etc. It has recipes. It's a 4-week guide. Last question I'm going to ask you. This conversation came up when I interviewed Dr. Tom O'Brien, who I imagine you're familiar with his work. He brought up the question that he says he's at dinner with other fellow people who are studying the gut microbiome, and the same conversation comes up, and it's this question: are we humans with a whole bunch of species and a vast array of microbiome? I forget the term he used. Are we humans with a whole bunch of bacteria, or are we bacteria living in a human body.
I'm not sure the answer is the chicken egg thing, but it is clear
Right.
that we really are crawling with microbes. And if we ignore them, I microbes are a big determinant of the internal dialogue we have in our brains. And I really believe it makes a difference between being content and happy or being violent and hateful. It's that stark.
Yeah.
And so we've entered a time, of course, where there is a lot of hate. And there's always been hate among humans, but it seems to have gotten kind of a megaphone
Yeah.
lately. It's gotten worse and become more widespread. I don't think this was true in the 50s. And I think at least part of it is due to the disruption of the microbiome. Just restoring rotary, that alone is a big effect. Restoration of empathy, concern for other people, being closer to other people, more intense love and affection. So I think that's a big step in the right direction.
Yeah, amen to that. That's why you have such an amazing attitude and energy. You got your rotary going on. We all want to have the energy that Dr. William Davis has. Where else can they go check you out? You want them to go to Amazon to get your book? Is there somewhere else? So share a little bit about where they can find you.
Well, the books in all major bookstores, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, all that kind of stuff. There's also more information on my new website. I had a bunch of websites and Facebook. I kind of consolidated a lot of stuff, Ben, and it's called Dr. Davis, Dr. Davis, infinitehealth.com, including I have a membership site, the Inner Circle, where we do this typically Wednesday night for a couple hours. I've got it tonight. We talk for a couple hours and we talk about the microbiome and vitamin D and diet and all that kind of stuff. About 70 to 100 people come on. So there's that if anybody wants a real intense experience. But there's also the blog, the Dr. Davis Infinite Health blog, where I talk about there's about 2,000 articles on there.
Wow.
Talking about all these kinds of issues, including new ideas. Like I'm just about to post a conversation on Turicibacter. It's a unique microbe, also recovered from ancient mummies, called Turicibacter sanguinis, that appears to be, you've heard this, serotonin is necessary in the brain for maintenance of mood and prevention of depression. So the current crop of selective serotonin uptake inhibitors, SSRIs, are meant to increase serotonin. What wasn't clear, 90%, you've likely heard this, 90% of the body's serotonin comes from the GI tract. Well, it's become clear also that 50% of that production from the GI tract is under the control of microbes. And a group at UCLA have narrowed it down to this one species, Turicibacter sanguinis, is responsible for serotonin. Well, we don't have that yet. I don't know if it'll make a good yogurt. But we get our hands on it and think about that. This is why I'm so excited, Ben, because it's potentially things like that and rotary and other things. I think they're going to eclipse pharmaceuticals because they're becoming so powerful. We potentially have in our future a microbial means of addressing depression. I think that's a big deal.
Yeah, especially in this day and age. That's amazing. Well, thank you, Doc, for being always on the cutting edge of the research and bringing us your amazing attitude, energy, experience. It was just an amazing conversation, the interview I was looking forward to since we booked it. I loved your work. I've been loving your work for several years and grateful for this book. Everybody go get the book. And I want to thank you for coming on the show today, Doc.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate it. I really do mean it when I say, please keep on doing what you're doing because it is so damn important in a day and age where most of us, like you and me, are not allowed to speak on big media anymore. We have to make our own media for delivering these kinds of messages.
Amen. I'll keep showing up, Doc.